Welcome everyone to our 15th webinar, the last webinar of 2020. This is a timely end to the year. I got an email about 40 minutes ago from our ISO editor, and he said that in the ISO database, we've been updated from status 50, so proof of international standard, to status 60, which is international standard. And what that means in practice is that OpenChain is simply awaiting publication, scheduled in the database for the 14th of December. And when we come back after the new year with our webinar series, that will be something that we'll be addressing in a whole series of talks. Some of these talks will be from user companies talking about how they conformed to the ISO standard. Some of these talks will be from service providers talking about how they've helped their clients do the same. So it's going to be a very exciting period in time. But ending this year, and I think this is a very important thing, ending this year, we're going right back to the beginning, how people come into open source. And we're very lucky to have had Michael Poe agree to dig into his journey to open source. And I thought this was a very special talk to have for a simple reason. We in the open source community have quite a lot of experience. And quite often, we're looking at many years in this field. So by way of example, I have approximately 17 years in the field, and some people have been around a lot longer than me. Now, that's great, but we must never forget how we got here, and we must never forget about how that journey went. And most interesting of all is how that journey goes today, because that's something that's really different. When we started with open source, it was a completely different galaxy for a lot of us. And what happens today is, of course, extremely educational. And given that we're an ISO standard and our huge international community and our growing activities, it's super important that we find ways to make sure that people can become part of OpenChain, that they can adopt the standard, that people new to open source feel super welcome. We've already done this with some completely new companies. For example, companies in consumables have joined the OpenChain community. What we haven't really done yet is engaged at scale with people who are not familiar with open source. And that's where Michael's insights will help us. Now, before we formally get started, I'm going to share our antitrust notice. We always put up the antitrust policy notice at the beginning of meetings. And for those of you who've been on our calls before, you'll be aware that the antitrust policy is on the Linux Foundation website. And of course, we have a counsel who assists us in these matters, who is available at any time to answer questions. And it's all up on that slide there. And if you need further information, just let me know. So, without further ado, let's dive in. OpenChain is an ISO standard. We're about to get a huge release across the world. It's going to be super cool. And we've had an incredible year in building out. We're really busy at the moment working on our website and making things new. So again, just before I bring Michael on, let me just give you a tiny glimpse of where we're going with the website. Since yesterday, or today for you, it has been possible to conform to OpenChain 2.1 on our website. In other words, functionally identical to the ISO standard that's coming in a few days. And it's functionally identical to OpenChain 2.0 as well. The only big difference is format. The website is getting updated to help people who are brand new land, understand, and conform. And that journey to conformance will very frequently begin with their journey to open source. And I'm really grateful that we actually have Michael today to help dig into that and what it means for people. So just dashing forward on this website, this very slow website. Michael has been new to open source, but he's sales manager at FosID, and he's going to talk about his journey from consumer products to software and how our community has lent a hand on the way. Without further ado, Michael, I will hand over to you and I'll stop screen sharing.
Okay, thank you very much, Shane. And hello, everyone. I'm super happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen now. And hopefully we can get rocking and rolling. Okay, there we go. Can you see it? Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes,
perfect.
sir.
So yeah, again, thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity to engage with everyone. I remember, I think it was on day 3 or 4 that I joined FosID. I was fortunate enough to have a nice chat with Shane, and he suggested, hey, you want to come on and do a webinar? I'm like, what are you talking about? But okay, sure, why not? And that's just very typical of how this journey has been, kind of thrown into the deep end, but not quite left on my own devices to sink or swim. Just by way of comparison, I'm not sure how many of you are crime series fans, but my journey, I like to think of it as kind of going from The Wire to The Bridge. And this is very poignant because I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland, which is where The Wire takes place. And I now live in Malmo in Sweden, which is where The Bridge takes place. And, you know, my path to open source and open source compliance as a discipline is one I would characterize by transformation. It's a transformation of thought. You know, what is open source? It's a transformation of understanding and a realization that it's actually not all Greek to me. And in that, or because of that, there's also been a transformation of ambition and of value in terms of the value that I can see in the role that open source and compliance and everything that goes around modern software development has to play in the transformation of the world as a whole. As Shane mentioned, I started my career in consumer products goods, having worked in tobacco and food industry, hence sticks to stacks now. And I did that for over 20 years after graduating and getting my MBA from Duke University in the US. And I've made quite the journey to get here. I've lived and worked on 5 different continents. And, you know, I guess consumer products to open source compliance and software composition and analysis tools is quite a hard pivot. And I'm actually even a podcaster. So this is a shameless plug for my podcast. Go check it out if you're so inclined. So without much further ado, I'd love to get into how I made the transition and what made this a reality. And like most things in life, it all started with a conversation and a connection. And then importantly, I read this book, the Open Source Compliance in the Enterprise book by Ibrahim Haddad. And in many ways, this book fundamentally is responsible for my being here right now in my office at Foss ID today. And I devoured this book in a couple of days. It was fantastic. And to my surprise, I actually understood it. So thanks to Ibrahim for that book. So a transformation of thought. You know, before I began this transition and this journey, I had heard of open source, of course, but I thought of it as something dark, something nerdy, something on the fringe, you know? I had no awareness whatsoever of the role that open source plays in our everyday lives. And this to me has been quite eye-opening. It's a realization, almost an awakening to the fact that the digital transformation of the world that we all so desire and have become used to, it is not possible without open source. And within the tech landscape, I guess, becoming so increasingly important and technology becoming so ingrained in our modern lives, and it's so exciting and cool to be a part of it. And yeah, like I said, it's like I've had an awakening, and it's super energizing and exciting to be connected to this industry that's driving so much positive change in the world, and it's super dynamic, And I one of the things that surprised me so much is that I came to the realization that you don't necessarily have to be a coder to be a part of this world. There's room for both technical as well as non-technical contributions. And, I think that was pretty eye-opening for me. It gave me a lot of confidence. And, it really helped, along with the people, help to pull me in and get me on, my learning journey. And just to call out a few of those people, they've been instrumental in transforming my understanding and helping me to navigate my learning agenda. And I think this speaks a lot to the core of the underlying principles of open source. I've found it to be a community that's extremely welcoming. I've found it to be a community that values sharing, discussion, knowledge, and the transfer of that knowledge. And, at my disposal and so freely available have been really amazing thought leaders and minds within the open source and the open source compliance space, who have shared their time, shared their knowledge. There's the Linux Foundation, and all the wonderfully available resources that are there. It's an incredibly rich amount of material that's there. And it's not just for developers or engineers, or even lawyers for that matter. People like Shane, who offered me this slot and, welcomed me with open arms. Ibrahim, who I mentioned, who's been, through his book, has been pretty instrumental in demystifying open source compliance for me. And of course, the leadership team here at Foss ID, John Aldama and Oscar Swirton, who basically saw value in what I could contribute to us as a company. And they've been very encouraging to my growth on an almost daily basis. And I sit in the work groups and some of the webinars, and even virtual conferences like the recent open source summit in Europe was amazingly helpful to me. And what I've been able to uncover along the way, And it's only been a few short months. So I've been here for just over 3 months. Um, the enterprise value that's created through the use of open source software is a pivotal thing. How to position it to executives, um, and encourage its awareness, to those outside of the development or engineering or even legal communities. Um, that's been a bit eye-opening for me, and I think it's going to play an increasingly important role in the broader adoption of things like OpenChain and getting quality, trusted compliance through the supply chain. I think it's been eye-opening and to see how the use of open source software drives innovation in general, and how leveraging it increases actually your bottom line and the business value of the organizations that embrace the responsible use of open source. Um, I'm fascinated in compliance, even though I don't know why I picked this, but compliance in a container world. I think this is something that I look forward very much to diving into, especially as it relates to tooling, and how complex that can be. And yeah, it's just really exciting for me to be involved in this area. And I think that with things like the OpenChain certification, it's evident that we're going to see a greater adoption of compliance. Chain often says we're going to go from hundreds to thousands, and to be a part of that, and to be invested in that is pretty darn exciting. So um, really happy to be there. But, I would say that my journey it's just begun. And I'm excited about where it will lead me. Um, and I think that, funnily enough, it's going to be a journey without a destination. There'll be, or at least without an end. There will be lots of milestones along the way, but um, you know, it's only going to be new horizons. So that's really fun, and that drives my ambition because it's going to keep it super exciting. It's going to fuel curiosity, um, and so far, yeah, it's going great, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how the continuous development of the tools that help businesses embrace compliance, how they evolve, um, along with the compliance complexities in the world. And I think that the shift of more, I would say, traditional companies to more software defined independent models is going to be interesting, and how this transformation evolves relative to the open source inputs and managing that from a compliance and process and supply chain point of view. So those are some of the things which are sort of top of mind at the moment for me. And as I look forward to someone who is new to this world, I've thought about, okay, but what are some of the challenges? And from my perspective, where do I see some of the challenges happening? And I think that, with OpenChain being granted its ISO certification, which is just an amazing, amazing achievement and great result, I think it's going to also be a challenge because it's going to mean that there are going to be companies that will be forced to take compliance a bit more seriously, who have not done so in the past, at least if they want to stay in the good graces of, their supply chain. And that is a good thing, but we should, I think, keep in mind that while these companies may have developers, engineers, or even legal people who understand and value compliance and open source, there are going to be some senior executives who are kind of just like me and are going to have to see the light, and, you know, get the fog removed on what this is. And I think that is really about, or that will be driven by seeing the value. Um, what is the value that compliance brings to the bottom line? And, you know, that, I think that will be primarily the big challenge, moving forward. And I think making compliance easier. Whilst it's definitely manageable for the non-technical, non-experienced person, um, as it relates, and I found this on my journey thus far, as it relates to licenses, and how they work together with internal policies, you know, I think getting over that hurdle over time is something which will pose a challenge. And how can we make it to something that people want to do instead of something people have to do? And that kind of goes back to the value statement as well. I know, and I think inclusivity is important, and I speak to that directly as a non-technical person, and making sure that it's apparent that there is room within the community for non-technical and technical people alike. And then the last thing I think, which is super important, is diversity and inclusion. You know, as a Black male, I'd look around and I look in the community, there are not a lot of me. I know my scope is not that wide and there are many people, but I think it is something that, you know, we all kind of know the statistics, and we all know the reality. It's not just about a racial thing. It's just gender. It's lots of elements, where I think most people know it's something which needs to be addressed. And I'm sure many of you within your organizations are even doing something about it now, but it's something which I think needs to be kept on the front burner as opposed to the back burner, once, you know, the trendiness of it, if you will, kind of dies down. So that's, I guess, my time. I wanted to keep it short, keep it light. Obviously, I'm not going to get into some of the deeper elements on tooling. That could be for another time, and maybe in 6 months, when I've got my technical script down packed. But thank you so much. And I look forward to connecting with all of you, whether it be, you can find me on LinkedIn, you can check out my podcast, shoot me an email, another shameless plug, and of course, email as well. So thank you very much for this opportunity, Shane. And yeah, I look forward to meeting all of you, whether it be virtually or in the future when we connect in person again. Thank you.
Thank you. That's I think, very useful insight into how people just entering the community see and feel. And, you know, I wanted to touch on the inclusion item, because traditionally, I think that's been the weakest part of technology, and certainly the weakest part of open source. If you if you look around a room, the majority is basically middle-aged Caucasians, and that's really something that we have to address. And this goes beyond. I think this goes beyond even addressing it in terms of North America and Europe, but in the reality that the future lies in essentially China and India. And yet the amount of bridges between China and Europe and North America in open source are limited, not non-existent, but certainly limited. We have in Linux Foundation made a lot of progress here. And in gender equality, we've made a lot of progress too. I'm not sure if you're aware of this. This is general audience awareness. But Linux Foundation has some simple policies. For example, no panels without at least one female panelist. And it's kind of depressing that we had to even introduce something like that, but it was a necessity to just encourage basic diversity. And it strikes me that the vast majority of human intellectual capital is not accurately reflected in the open source community today. And of course, the open source community today will become less relevant or even potentially irrelevant if other open source communities are first forced to occur. So for example, if the Chinese companies can't become deeply embedded in what we do today, let's say that they don't progress much further than currently in engagement. Some of it will be language, some of it will be culture, some of it will be politics. Well, China's over 1.3 billion people. It's larger than North America and Western Europe by far. And if we throw India into the mix, we're now approaching half of humanity. And that's just those two places. So it's pretty clear that in our pre-existing open source communities, diversity must occur. First and foremost, because it's right. And secondly, because it's necessary. And I'm not sure how we do that. The only thing I can think of, I mean implementation, the only thing I can think of is that the people best positioned to map out implementation and to lead implementation are those who are not traditionally reflected in the community or inadequately reflected. We need more leaders to be female. We need more leaders to be from different areas in the world. We need people who are African American. We need people who are Chinese, who are Indian, at the absolute center of open source, leading the projects, leading the teams. And I'd like to make that one of the missions for 2021 in OpenChain. Of all the projects in the entire world, right now, we are best positioned for a global audience. It's not just because of ISO, it's because we have local work groups in China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, India, of course, Germany and the UK as well, and we're launching a US work group. We probably could be well positioned to do this, though we will have to find future leaders, and they're emerging. I don't know if you've seen it, but our newest work group, by way of example, is led by Balakrishna in India, and that's our education work group working on our new online training course, which will be CC0. And I think that's super cool. And I wanted to throw open to you as our audience in OpenChain. This is our final meeting of the year for the webinar series. Of course, we'll have a specification meeting later next week. But I'd like to throw to you the audience. Given that the whole world will look at us and pay attention to us in OpenChain, and given the vast scope of Linux Foundation, why doesn't everyone have a think about how we can do things even better next year? And you know, part of it is simply making it easier for people to join our community. And that's why Michael's talk was so important. Part of it is proactively seeking the leaders of the future and giving them a pivotal role in our projects today. So that's basically something I foresee for OpenChain. I'm foreseeing increased diversity in new work groups and existing work groups. I'm seeing that we will have leadership from different parts of the world. And you know, in some cases, some of the activities around OpenChain and reference material are translated into English from other languages like Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. I see that escalating. And indeed, I don't think English will be the first language of open source in 10 years. It's a trade language, it's useful, but it's not actually the first language of a huge amount of the people invested in the future of software. And that's something we really need to think about. So if you're willing to jump in, I just wanted to throw to you as the audience, if you have any observations or ideas or comments on the whole thing. Everyone's like, I don't want to speak first.
Well, Shane, this is Jeff Lush here, and I just wanted to first thank Michael for his talk today and kind of his introduction. And it's always amazing and interesting to hear how people find themselves in this world of open source. In terms of what you asked, I think one of the things I'm looking at for this upcoming year, beyond just the things that we always know we should be doing, we should always be documenting our work. We should always be doing outreach. But one of the things that I'm looking forward to in the next year is more mentorship for a specific person. One of my goals for the year is to pick somebody and work with to help them learn and explore their use of open source, compliance, etc. Outside of work, outside of my day-to-day. But that is something that I've always found very helpful in my career when people have reached out to me to where I was the mentee, not the mentor. And I really want to pass that on in the year of 2021 is how do we become better mentors and not just a drive-by, but really help somebody in their career and their education and their life. So that's something that's on my list, and I'm always looking for opportunities to do that and help others in that way.
That's a really good point. Maybe we can have a mentorship program starting in compliance because it's mission critical. And if we could assign mentors to, let's say, new entities approaching us or new people approaching us, it might give a great contribution. I like that idea. One thing I wanted to raise related to this as well was investment. So OpenChain is not a super rich project, but we do have a marketing budget and we do have capital. And using that marketing budget in 2021, we don't need to hold physical events. In fact, I'm confident there will be no physical events until at least Q3. So I'm very happy for OpenChain in the context of open source license compliance to invest in activities under the marketing banner that can further the concept of diversity and therefore further our growth as a standard and as a community. So if you have any ideas about that, come up to me, bring it up on a call, and let's consider how we can invest in that. One idea I've had with the new webinar series in 2021 is to explicitly ask some of the regional leaders to come forward and to talk about what they're doing. But we need to do more than talk. We need to actually take action. So yeah, if there's one takeaway from this webinar, it's that there's plenty left to do post-ISO. And actually on this webinar, I did want to give you an insight into where the project is going to go next. So phase 1 of OpenChain was all about creating the standard and making it useful. Phase 2 of OpenChain was what we just finished. Essentially getting the standard adopted and having both the optics and the capability to grow from local regions to different sectors. And the end of that phase was where OpenChain as a de facto standard became a formal standard. And we've done that. We expect to be published by ISO as ISO IEC 5230 2020 on the 14th of December. Phase 3. Phase 3 is coming, and that's where I think we're going to see some exciting activity. And I wanted to give you an insight into what phase 3 will be. So the first activity in the next phase of OpenChain will be focused on how this standard can be advocated effectively globally. And this project will continue to talk to the industry, but also increase activity talking with national governments. We have conversations in the US, China, Germany, and the UK underway with the national standardization or related government policy organizations. We will extend that reach in 2021, probably first through political activity in Taiwan, and escalating through Japan, Korea, and of course, India. So essentially, the first part of phase 3 is the lobbying activity to make sure people understand the value of the standard. The second part, running at the same time, is to build out the idea of owning the compliance space. This is something that I think is worth considering. We are the top level standard for open source license compliance, period. We're the ISO standard for quality compliance programs. And that means we're in the position to steer the global dialogue around reasonable, effective, real world open source compliance. And I think that's a role we should actively take in our community and as a project. That's something I expect that we will actively do to steer the discussion on open source compliance to ensure that the messaging on compliance is consistent, reliable, and easily understood by the global audience, removing the uncertainty of multiple viewpoints on what is the correct approach to compliance. Narrow that down, own that space. And finally, the third part of phase 3 is information. And that's where these webinars come in, and where other things like our mini summits come in. OpenChain has had 15 webinars this year. We've held a couple of mini summits. We have been by far the most active organization in open source governance in terms of education. And in 2021, we will continue that mission with the concept that any organization doing open source compliance can see what companies are doing around the world, can hear what global experts are saying, and can be guided on strategy decisions for the future based on what their peers are doing. So there you have it, phase 3. Lobbying to embed us in governments as well as industry. Owning the compliance space to make sure that the dialogue is singular, rational, and real-world effective. And finally, making sure, leading in the dissemination of knowledge with events, our reference library, and of course, access to all of the expertise across our broad community. And that's what you can expect in 2021. With the ISO standard out, we're not done. We're just beginning. Now we have the framework to guide the future, and we execute next year. So I think it's exciting. And I hope that everyone on this call will be part of that. We need your expertise and knowledge. And what you can do, what you can bring to the table is absolutely incredible. I want to pause here and just see if there's anything that you personally would like to see OpenChain do in addition to what I outlined. Okay, finally, to wrap this up, I will tell you what our partners are planning to do next year. OpenChain's, let's say, marketing will primarily be addressed towards the existing Linux Foundation membership, because that's, first of all, the majority of open source investment with explicit knowledge in the industry. In other words, companies who know they're doing open source and are investing in its future. So we're going to put a lot of time into that, as well as the global outreach, which will be equally useful for anyone. And we're going to lean on our partners across the world, whether it's PwC or TÜV, whether it's a major law firm, whether it's a consultancy like Wipro. We're going to lean on these companies for their sales channels to gain access to their customers, all these companies which might not have much awareness of OpenChain. And we're going to be doing OpenChain talks and calls, and we're going to leverage that as our primary new entity growth avenue, in addition to things like our local work groups, which have definite growth, but we have far more growth potential through the partner network, and the partners are on board to give us access and ability. So OpenChain Central, a lot of our communication will be explicitly directed at Linux Foundation members, but equally useful to everyone. And we'll be leveraging the official partner network to gain access to thousands of other companies outside of the 1,600 in LF. And that's the basic strategy of the partners. And as you probably know, every official partner of OpenChain has to commit to certain activities which go far beyond selling a product. They have to support this community and ensure that we are entirely focused on user companies as a project. And that's it. That's what we're doing. So unless there's any more comments or ideas or suggestions, we're going to wrap it up there and end up this webinar with a final thank you to you. You made it happen. Incredible. It's a historic achievement because now compliance is boring forever. We needed that. So thank you, everyone. In case we don't have you on another call, have a wonderful holiday season. And special thanks to Michael for giving a presentation that I think will resonate with a lot of people who will be looking at OpenChain in the coming months. Have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon.